Goenka, ladies and gentlemen, let me at the very outset thank Vivek for having invited me to associate with this grand function where the Ramnath Goenka Awards for Excellence in Journalism are being awarded today. I've had the privilege and opportunity of having known Ramnath ji and having worked with him quite closely. And amongst people from various walks of life that we have all dealt with, I've never had the least hesitation in my mind in acknowledging that probably Ramnath Goenka was the most fascinating gentleman that I ever knew. I'd heard of him as a young student. I first met him in 1974, almost 41 years ago. The JP movement was on, and Shri Narayan had come to Delhi. And there were two places where he used to be available. One was a small bungalow next to the Gandhi Peace Foundation where he used to live. And most of the daytime, he used to meet a lot of people in Ramnath ji's guest house in what is now the New Indian Express building. It was a single floor guest house. And I had an appointment to meet JP to invite him to the Delhi University. When I entered the living room of that guest house, there were about 4 or 5 people of Ramnath ji's vintage close friends. Ramnath ji was there, JP was there, Nanaji Deshmukh was there. And the fourth gentleman I remember used to be a Congress MP from Bihar, who was a great friend of theirs called Mr. Gangadhar Singh. I wonder if Vivek still remembers him. Not many people remember him. After that, I maintained some contact with Ramnath ji because he was a central figure in the movement those days. His adversaries used to address him as the representative of what they called the jute press. And of course, he was a relentless fighter. A few months after that, the emergency was imposed. Most of us were in detention. Ramnath ji was effectively removed from the control of the Indian Express. But if there was one instrumentality outside the prison system which kept fighting the emergency, that was the Indian Express. While in detention, even that censored newspaper was of great value to us. We would at times stare at the empty, blank lead editorial, which was symbolic of the fact that he wanted to say something and was not allowed to write that. Either on the edit page or in the edited news columns, which had been censored between the lines, you could always get a feel of what the newspaper wanted to convey. And that was a time, whatever he had at stake, he had invested in the struggle for democracy during the emergency. As a newspaper owner, he had a few ideas which he had inculcated all these years. He started the newspaper when the British were ruling India. Very little is known about the fact that during the Quit India movement, when censorship was imposed, he chose to close down the newspaper rather than submit it for censorship. and then restart the newspaper once the censorship was removed. He was for a brief while in the Madras Legislative Council or Assembly, one of the two bodies. And he had made it through that route into the Constituent Assembly. He very proudly used to show to us one of the speeches that he had delivered in the Constituent Assembly on newspaper censorship. And the subject matter of discussion in the Constituent Assembly was imposition of tax on newspapers. And he said that a time will come when governments will never use or resort to crude methodologies like censorship of physically preventing newspapers or articles from coming out, but would probably resort to pinching the pockets of the newspapers, that's the phrase he had used, in order to make sure that they could control the media itself. And he had very strongly spoken against that proposal of empowering states or center to impose taxation on newspapers. His personal history and that of his newspaper was almost subsequently in the history of Indian politics post-independence. But it was through the 70s and the 80s that we saw the best in him. During the period 69-70, when most of the people were going in favor of state controls and so on, he was quite vocal against it. Not many would remember, I'm sure Mr. Kuldeep Nair would recollect, that during the period 69, 70, 71, his editor Frank Moraes used to virtually write a front page column regularly, giving the alternate viewpoint of the economic policies and other policies. It used to be called Myth and Reality, which was one of the most read columns those days. There was a second personal experience that he had, and I think that's a big challenge today that Indian media faces. From big to small, people involved in various kinds of other businesses also tend to control media organizations. And the editorial columns then reflect, the news columns then start reflecting the obvious conflict of the different interests that they have. He also dabbled in other businesses, lost a lot of money in them. At one stage was a massive CBI case was built up against him. He was prosecuted and then acquitted in Chennai. He then realized that a newspaper has to be a standalone business. But how do you then support economically and financially a standalone business if you don't have other economic support to the newspaper? And his conventional Marwari wisdom was that wherever you establish a media center, you must establish a big real estate center there. So all the offices, the buildings, the guest houses, the printing presses that he started establishing in one metropolitan town after another was never for his personal wealth. The income generated out of that, he continuously was then led into the newspaper company, and that supported the newspaper. So his model of keeping the newspaper a reasonable distance away from other business interests and then having his own real estate, so whether it was Delhi or Chennai or Mumbai, he first invested in simultaneously in large real estate, got a huge income out of that property, and all that income would go in supporting the newspaper itself. And that is probably what kept him going during the emergency, because he always had an independent income which could finance his newspaper losses. Having virtually become the sole voice in favor of democracy during that period, I think the later part of the 70s was personally a sad period for him, because having lost his son Bhagwan Das, he went into a little bit of a shell. But in 1980 or so, he suddenly woke up again to his best. During peacetime, he was like fish out of water. He loved a fight. So when the Congress government came back to power, Mrs. Gandhi came back to power in 1980, the first attack was again on the Indian Express. And this is what saw the second round of the best in the man. And that is when some of us youngsters were almost in daily contact with him. He was never to be cowed down by any such fight. From his newsprint allocations, to his advertisements, to his buildings, to his tax cases. At one stage, he had some 700 prosecutions against his newspaper, being summoned almost every part of the country. And he had a whole team of people who were fighting him. A strike was engineered in his office to physically make sure that the paper doesn't publish. But then he remained committed to the kind of values that he was himself committed to. He was a great one, and I'm sure Vivek in his younger days must have felt the pinch of it for insisting on saving money. He hated the idea of anybody being spendthrift, so when people travelled, whether it was his advisors or friends or even Vivek, the first thing he would go and look at their handbags to see whether they had travelled in executive class or in the economy class. He was a great disciplinarian. I've seen him till the mid-1980s, driving himself his old ramshackle Fiat car. He even disliked the idea of keeping a driver on whom he had to spend money who would drive his vehicle, but was very large-hearted when it came to fighting for his space in the media as such. How do I look back on him and relate it to the current stage of Indian journalism? He was fearless. He could almost risk anything at stake. He deeply had a sense of pride about the fact that a newspaper is supposed to expose corruption, a newspaper is supposed to expose injustice wherever it finds it. He gave his paper a direction, whether it was human rights, it was corruption. He had his own strong political views also. He had friends almost across the spectrum. And I remember his last battle was when he realized that this was probably the last chance when his paper may or may not survive towards the end of the 1980s. That he almost put in everything that he had into the 1989 electoral battle. So the period from 1986, 87 to 89 was the last political battle in that sense that he fought. Risking almost everything, emerged victorious out of that. And it was a consistent observation that anybody who knew him well would realize that never wanted to be a part of any power structure as such. And therefore he fought his battles, the battles produced their results, and he immediately distanced himself from those positions of exercising influence in power as such. I think probably one of the most fascinating characters that India has ever seen. And it's a fit tribute to him that nobody could represent this values of fearless and independent journalism that he did. And to have a award of such prominence instituted in his name is something that he eminently deserves. He's an essential part of India's media history. And I think when we live in an era where mediocrity at times dominates, to select excellence out of that and reward it year by year, and as you just mentioned, a large number of recipients are recipients several times over of this award, I think is a fitting tribute to him. I pay my respects to the memory of Ramnath ji, my best wishes to the Indian Express, which I'm sure will keep alive the values that he cherished the most. Indian Express is his legacy, and his legacy certainly deserves the best that was represented in his lifetime itself. And my compliments to all those and congratulations to all those who have been honored with this recognition today. Thank you.